Hi everyone, it's Liz here. I'm just going to talk through the sequencing activity that you've been set for this week. I've got an example here with a Year 8 maths class, and you'll see on the right hand side an extract of their assessment task that comes at the end of this unit of work. So you'll see that students need to find the area of the sections on the pyramid here, and then to calculate the percentages that each section of the pyramid represents. So if I was teaching this unit of work, there will be a number of different curriculum that I will be teaching. For example, finding the area of shapes and calculating percentages. In my response to this activity, I'm going to just focus on calculating percentages, teaching students how to calculate percentages. You take a similar approach with your activity. Whichever assessment task you've chosen, you can imagine a range of parts of the curriculum that you would have to teach students for them to be able to complete that assessment task. But you're just going to choose one particular part of the curriculum for this activity. So you can see my chosen curriculum here on the left. So that's the first step. Step 2 is to develop your CUDs. So usually when we develop CUDs, we think about them in relation to the whole assessment task. But for this activity, just write down some CUDs that relate to that one or maybe two parts of the curriculum that you're focusing on. So you can see here I've got a number. It's not an extensive list, but things that students would need to know about proportions, about place value, understandings that they'd need to have, again, around place values, around proportions, and a number of things that they would need to be able to do. For example, converting decimals to fractions and percentages. So after you've developed your CUDs, you're then going to move into developing your lesson sequence. Now, I've included a reasonable amount of detail here. You don't necessarily need to be so detailed. Keep the purpose of this activity in mind. The purpose is for you to practice putting lessons in order, sequencing lessons in a way that's both logical and that builds in complexity, so that each time students come back to your class, they're being moved to the next level, challenged that little bit more. We're also practicing how we can embed opportunities to check for students' understanding and creating links between lessons. So this first lesson here, you can see my lesson objective is related to one of the CUDs about students understanding how quantities that are in proportion can be both increased and decreased in proportion. So I'm going to spend 5-10 minutes really quickly just recapping proportionality, recapping the language that we need to describe this. 2 per 5, meaning 2 for each 5. We're going over a strategy that we can use to calculate the proportions. Now, after I've recapped that, I'm going to then extend into percent. So you can already see in these first 2 parts of the lessons how the complexity is developed just that little bit. So I will teach students about percent, revising that percent means out of 100. Then we'll do some practice around finding an unknown amount. And you can see the strategy that I'm going to teach them here using a hundreds chart. Now, my formative assessment is an exit slip, and I'm going to have leveled questions that relate to the 2 things that we've covered in this lesson around proportions and calculating an unknown amount. Now, in my link for the next lesson, I'm going to include a challenge question on the exit slip, and that's about finding an unknown percentage. So that will help me to understand what students have taken away from this lesson. Are there any who are ready to move on? Do students already know how to calculate an unknown percentage? You don't need to make your lesson links as explicit as this necessarily, but sometimes it's quite obvious, how lessons are related to one another, but you need to keep it in mind and make sure that there definitely is a link. So when we come back for lesson 2, we're going to focus on converting numbers between percentages, fractions, and decimals. I'm going to start that lesson by recapping what we did in the last lesson. So we're going to solve a problem where students need to find the unknown amount. How long I spend on this activity will depend on what I found through my analysis of that formative assessment data. So are students ready to move on, or do we need to spend a little bit more time here? Do I need to do some small group work? Once I feel confident that my students are ready to move on, we'll move into finding an unknown percentage. So we'll explicitly teach how to find an unknown percentage. And then we'll move on to decimals. So we start by thinking, well, where in the world do I see decimals? Where are decimals around us? And then we'll look at how to represent percent as fraction and decimal. So you can again see in this lesson how there's a logical progression of ideas, building those skills around calculating percentages. My formative assessment for this lesson is a math maze where students make their way through this maze using their skills in converting percentages, fractions and decimals. And I'm going to, just spend 5 minutes at the end of that lesson doing a bit of a preview for the next lesson where we're going to change the unit from ones to hundreds. So all of these skills are needed for students to be able to complete the assessment task that they have at the end, and it's related to the curriculum that we're trying to meet. So I can't remember if I already said this, but in this lesson plan, you don't necessarily need to include this much detail. Just keep the purpose of this activity in mind about practicing sequencing lessons, building complexity, checking for students' understanding.